In this session, we'll trace the story of Israel from King Solomon's reign to the time when Jesus was born. Solomon succeeded David as king of Israel around 970 BC. Israel entered a unique period of peace and prosperity. The land yielded crops abundantly. God's people were well fed, happy, and secure. God gave Solomon great wisdom and wealth and fame. Solomon was the main author of the book of Proverbs. Solomon's life and wisdom inspired the book of Ecclesiastes. The books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes teach us how to think and to live in this world. The Song of Songs is ascribed to Solomon. This is a romantic poem telling of the love between a young man and a young woman. 4 years after becoming king, Solomon began to build a house for God. That house was called the Temple. He built it on a hill just to the north of the city of Jerusalem. Here is an artist's impression of what Jerusalem might have looked like in Solomon's time. The temple is marked by the red circle. The city itself stretches down the hill below it. The temple's basic plan was like that of the tabernacle, but the temple was much bigger and much more splendid. It consisted of a large building surrounded by a courtyard. Here are sacrifices being prepared in the courtyard. This is an illustration of the temple. The walls have been cut away so you can see inside. In the courtyard on the right is the great altar for the sacrifices. At the bottom of this illustration you can see an enormous basin full of water, together with some smaller basins. The temple itself contained 2 large rooms, with smaller rooms around them. Here's a close-up view of the 2 main rooms. The larger room was the holy place. It contained 10 golden candelabra, a golden table for the bread, and a golden altar for incense. The smaller room was the most holy place. It was separated from the holy place by folding doors and a curtain. The inner walls, floor, and ceiling of these 2 rooms were all overlaid with gold. Everywhere you could see there was gold. The gold reflected light from the candelabra and filled the room with a glorious golden glow. To enter this room would have been a wonderful, breathtaking, unforgettable experience. Here's a close-up view of the most holy place. This room contained the Ark of the Covenant. On either side of the ark were great statues of heavenly beings called cherubs. Like the tabernacle, the temple was God's royal palace. The most holy place was his throne room. It was the room where God lived here on earth. From this holy room, God reigned over his people. As we saw in Session 2, the Garden of Eden was God's home on earth. The tabernacle was also God's home on earth. Now the temple took over that function. It was God's new home on earth. And so the temple was like a new Garden of Eden, just as the tabernacle had been. The walls of the holy place and the most holy place were decorated with cherubs, palm trees, and flowers. You can clearly see the palm trees on the wall in this illustration. When the temple was complete, Solomon gathered Israel's leaders. He brought the Ark of the Covenant into the most holy place. You can see it here in the most holy place between the 2 statues of cherubs. Then God moved in. His glory cloud filled the temple. We read this: "A cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priests could not stand to minister because of the cloud." For the glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. As we've seen, Solomon built the temple on a hill overlooking Jerusalem. That hill became known as Mount Zion. Mount Zion was called God's holy mountain. This picture shows Solomon's temple on Mount Zion, above the city of Jerusalem. God's temple was on God's mountain. This connects to something we learnt in session 5. Centuries before this, the people of Babel had begun to build a city and a tower. The tower seems to have been a ziggurat, a step-sided tower with a temple on top. Here's a drawing of a typical ziggurat. The building on top is a temple. The ziggurat was dedicated to a pagan god. People believed that if they served that god properly, it would live in this temple. The Tower of Babel was intended to be a kind of man-made holy mountain with a temple on top, a place for their false god to live. But Mount Zion was a true holy mountain. That mountain too had a temple on top. That temple was the temple of Solomon. It was the temple where the true God lived. The people of Babel wanted a civilization where their God lived among them. In other words, they wanted to live in a paradise in the presence of their God. But it was a false paradise in the presence of a false God. But the promised land was a real paradise. God's people were living in God's paradise in the presence of the true God. In the previous session, we saw that the promised land was strategically positioned at the crossroads of the world. Israel, indicated on this map by the red marker, was God's bridgehead into a world under Satan's domination. That bridgehead was now secured. So what was God's strategy for advance? Firstly, he wanted to show the nations around what he was like: holy, righteous, trustworthy and kind. God's law, the sacrifices and festivals, the peace and well-being of his people, the beauty and fruitfulness of the land, all these things would teach the surrounding nations about the one true God. Secondly, God wanted to show what humans were meant to be like. God's people were a new humanity. They were to show the world how being in relationship with God transforms people. In fact, Israel was to be like a magnet, attracting people to God and to his people and to his land. Some foreigners might even become members of God's people. God was now beginning to fulfill his covenant promises to Abraham. God had promised him a land. His descendants were now in that land. God had promised him a multitude of descendants. Now Abraham's descendants numbered thousands upon thousands. And God had promised Abraham that through him all the families of the earth would be blessed. Israel was now poised to be a blessing to the nations around. These promises to Abraham would be fulfilled in an even greater way one day, as we'll see later on our journey. This period of Israel's history was a foretaste of what was to come. But the battle between Satan and God and his people wasn't over. The ancient enemy wasn't giving up without a fight. Very soon things went wrong. God had told Israel that their kings must not have lots of horses, which would be mainly for military use. They must not have many wives, and they must not have too much silver and gold. Power, women, and wealth, these are a man's greatest temptations. Solomon fell for all three. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen. Secondly, he married the daughter of Pharaoh, the Egyptian king, and many other foreign women. God had forbidden this, saying that these wives would certainly draw the king to follow their pagan gods. Just as God had warned, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods, and his heart was not fully devoted to the Lord his God as the heart of David his father had been. And thirdly, Solomon amassed stupendous quantities of gold. So the Lord brought judgment on Israel. He caused the kingdom to be divided into two. This is how it happened. Solomon had conscripted people, both foreigners and Israelites, into labour gangs for his building projects, and he burdened the people with taxes to support him and his royal court. But Solomon's son, King Rehoboam, vowed to make the people's burden even heavier. So 10 of the 12 tribes of Israel rebelled against Rehoboam and set up their own kingdom. They appointed Jeroboam, one of Solomon's officers, as their king. So the country of Israel split into two parts, one to the north, the other to the south. Jeroboam's kingdom was the one to the north. It took over the name Israel. In this kingdom's later years, its capital was Samaria. Rehoboam's kingdom was the one to the south. It was called Judah. His capital was Jerusalem. His kingdom consisted of his own tribe of Judah, the tribe of Benjamin, many priests and Levites, and some people from other tribes too. Jeroboam didn't want his people to go to Jerusalem to worship God, so he set up 2 golden calves, at Bethel in the south of his kingdom, and at Dan in the north. These are the remains of Jeroboam's pagan temple in Dan. The framework in the centre of the picture shows the outline of the great altar there. The northern kingdom, Israel, ended up in gross idolatry. They never had a single godly ruler. One notorious king was Ahab. Here he is with his wife Jezebel, arguing with God's prophet Elijah, who is standing on the far left. On the right, people are worshipping a statue of the pagan god Baal. The northern kingdom had become like Canaan again. So God brought his judgment on that wicked kingdom. The local superpower of that time was Assyria. Their empire is marked out in orange on this map. The Assyrians captured the capital city, Samaria, in 722 BC. The northern kingdom, Israel, was absorbed into the Assyrian Empire. But the southern kingdom, Judah, did have some good kings. The best were Hezekiah and Josiah. They both destroyed idolatrous shrines and objects throughout the land and led the nation back to worshipping the true God. This picture shows Josiah. He's the man dressed in red. A man reads out God's law to him. Josiah tears his clothes to show how upset he is. He's upset because he realizes that the nation has not obeyed God. But Judah had some bad kings too. One notorious king was Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah. He did horrible things. He even set up pagan altars and images of a Canaanite goddess in God's temple. He made Judah like Canaan again. Time and again the nation fell into idolatry. Idols of the type shown here were found throughout Judah. They date from this period of history. God's people broke his heart. Israel was his beloved bride, but so often she abandoned God and worshipped idols. And instead of trusting God, she often allied herself to the superpowers of that time, the Egyptians, Assyrians, and Babylonians. Whatever was God to do, over hundreds of years he sent prophets to speak to his people. These included Elijah, Elisha, Amos, and Hosea in the northern kingdom, and Isaiah, Micah, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah in Judah. Many of these prophets, together with other prophets we haven't named here, wrote down prophecies that are included in our Bible. When Adam and Eve rebelled against God, he expelled them from the Garden of Eden. Now God's new mankind, Israel, rebelled against him. So God expelled them from his new garden, the Promised Land. Many people had already been deported from the northern kingdom. Now people from the southern kingdom, Judah, would be deported. In 605 BC, Babylonia became the superpower of the Middle East. This is a map of the Babylonian Empire around that time. Its capital, Babylon, is marked by the red circle. This is a reconstruction of a magnificent gate that was once in the city of Babylon. The Babylonians took control of Judah. Over a period of time, they deported many of Judah's inhabitants to Babylonia. The Babylonian king at this time was the famous Nebuchadnezzar II. The tragic climax came in 586 BC. Nebuchadnezzar besieged and destroyed Jerusalem. Solomon's magnificent temple was in ruins. Jerusalem was ravaged. God's people were in exile. There was no king. All the hopes that had blossomed when Solomon came to the throne had been dashed. But God's people prospered in Babylonia. This early photograph shows a typical river scene in that region. Around this time, Israelites became known as Jews. The Bible tells us about Jews who had positions of leadership in Babylonia. Among these were Daniel the prophet and Nehemiah, whom we meet later. However, in the books of Esther and Daniel, we also read about outbreaks of hostility towards Jews. But through the prophet Jeremiah, God had promised that his people in Babylonia would return to the Promised Land. In 539 BC, the Persian Empire took over the Babylonian Empire. This is a map of the Persian Empire. The Persian ruler Cyrus issued a decree urging Jews to return home and rebuild the temple. In fact, Cyrus had a policy of allowing displaced people to go home. This is the famous Cylinder of Cyrus. It's in the British Museum. It's a clay cylinder inscribed in an ancient script. In it, among other things, Cyrus boasts that he caused displaced people to return home. Although most Jews remained in Babylonia, many did make the long journey back to Judah. They began to rebuild the temple. This picture shows what it might have looked like. The front wall is cut away to show the entrance more clearly. But there was opposition to the building work and delay. But encouraged by the prophets Haggai and Zechariah, the people completed the new temple around 516 BC. This was about 70 years after Solomon's temple was destroyed. Years later, another Persian king sent 2 key men back to Judah. Ezra went to teach God's law and to make sure the Jews were obeying it. Later, Nehemiah went to Judah. The first thing he did was to oversee the rebuilding of the walls of the city of Jerusalem. In this painting, we see Nehemiah directing that project. But even after Jerusalem and the temple had been rebuilt, the nation was still only a pale shadow of what it had been under Solomon's reign. The new temple wasn't as magnificent as Solomon's temple. The Ark of the Covenant, which had been in the most holy place, was missing. The Bible does not tell us that God filled the new temple with his presence, like he did in the tabernacle and the temple of Solomon. Judah was still under foreign rule, and the Jews had no king. But this wasn't the end of the story. Through his prophets, God warned and reprimanded his people, but alongside his warnings and reprimands, God also gave his people a breathtaking vision of future glory. There would be a new Exodus and a new promised land, in fact, a new earth. There would be a new Jerusalem, a new temple, and a new king of David's dynasty. But however were all these wonderful things going to happen? God had expelled his people from the promised land because of their sin. Even after their return to the land, God's people were still sinning. Sin had to be dealt with. In the book of Daniel, chapter 9, verse 24, we read about God's plan to put an end to sin, to atone for wickedness, to bring in everlasting righteousness. How was this going to happen? In the next verse, we read about the coming of an anointed one, a prince. The Hebrew word for anointed one is Mashiach, from which we get the name Messiah. The anointed one, in other words, the Messiah, who would do all these wonderful things, is Jesus Christ. In verse 26 of Daniel 9, we read that an anointed one shall be cut off. In other words, the anointed one would die. Through his sacrificial death and his resurrection from the dead, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, would put an end to sin, atone for wickedness, and bring in everlasting righteousness. Isaiah chapter 53 tells us more. This is part of an ancient manuscript of the book of Isaiah. It shows part of chapter 53. In this chapter, Isaiah prophesies about the Messiah. He says that God would lay all our sin on him. He would be pierced for our transgressions. That is, he would suffer the penalty for our sin, the penalty we should have suffered. And Messiah would make many to be accounted righteous. In other words, he would make many people perfectly acceptable to God. Through the prophet Ezekiel, God promised his people, "I will sprinkle clean water on you, and you shall be clean." God was going to cleanse and purify his people. And through the prophet Jeremiah, God promised, "I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts." God's people would no longer be rebels. They would be able to obey God. Sin would be dealt with. People would be made acceptable to God, released from sin's penalty, cleansed, and given new, obedient hearts. And because sin was dealt with, all the other wonderful promises that God made through his prophets would be fulfilled. There would be a new Exodus and a new promised land, in fact, a new earth. There would be a new Jerusalem, a new temple, and a new king. God's people would live in God's paradise, in God's presence, forever. Hundreds of years would pass before Jesus would be born. During these centuries, God was preparing his people for the coming of Jesus, their Messiah. Firstly, God dealt with his people's idolatry. After their return to the promised land, they never again gave themselves over as a nation to idolatry as they had done before the exile. Secondly, God's people began to meet for prayer and study of the Scriptures at buildings called synagogues. It's not known for certain when God's people began to meet at synagogues, but it could well have been during the exile. This is a traditional synagogue. It's situated in New York, in the United States. The Scriptures themselves, too, were gathered together into what we now call the Old Testament. Finally, by the time that Jesus began his public ministry, many people were waiting and looking for the Messiah to come. Then, at God's appointed time, Jesus the Messiah was born. Our next session will take us from his birth right through to the days before his crucifixion.